Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and anybody else who snuck in. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Beautiful spring day out there. 2 years ago, it's unlikely that we would have had anybody in this room for a presentation on northern Mali. Today, of course, that situation is very different. I would say that 2 years ago, there were very few people who could probably put northern Mali on a map, let alone know who was operating in that part of the world. But again, rather unfortunately, that is not the case today. I suppose by way of introduction to the panelists, I'm reminded of a lovely story that was told about Pablo Picasso. Now, bear with me. A wealthy woman approached Pablo Picasso and asked for him to paint her portrait, which she said, "Certainly, madam." And he did the portrait in roughly 60 seconds. The lady was much annoyed and said, "Sir, I'm not paying you for a portrait that's taken you 60 seconds. To which Picasso, in some dudgeon, responded, "Madam, that took me 60 years and 60 seconds. The panelists we have arrayed before you today have not been following Mali and North Africa just for the past year or two, but between the three of them, and if I can add myself to their company, we have decades of experience in the region. And I trust you will appreciate that when they begin their presentations. By way of housekeeping, could I please ask that telephones are switched off before we begin, unless anybody's waiting for the pizza delivery man, of course. We are recording this presentation, and when telephones ring, it can interfere with the reception. This panel is on the record, so mind your language. We will begin with, I hope you managed to sign up, by the way, when you came in, simply because I would like to make available a recording of this session to everybody after the event. And also, we will be producing a briefing paper based on the panelists' comments today. That briefing paper may well be available by the end of the week. If I don't have your email addresses, it will complicate my getting it to you. So please do sign up, perhaps as you leave. Questions will be welcome at the end, but I'd ask you to write them down rather than do it by show of hands. In that way, I can be sure to get through more questions than we would ordinarily. There's also a sheet of paper at the front door when you came in, which was printed back to back, unlike my master copy, which has the bios for the speakers printed on it. So I will not cover all of that ground again, but simply introduce the panelists in brief in the order in which they will be speaking. To my immediate right is Michael Shirkin, political scientist at the Rand Corporation, who after many years working for the intelligence community has moved his gaze to, let me see, sorry. This wasn't supposed to go off before we started. Mike? Mike? Thank you. Isn't it always the way? On Michael's right is Larry Velte, who is at NISA, Near East South Asia Department at the National Defense University, another very eminent individual whose work on North Africa is second to none. And finally, on the extreme right of the table, rather than politically, although I don't know, we find Rida Liamari, who is with the Navanti group, most of whose product is for use by AFRICOM. So you would all do well to listen, as AFRICOM are obviously involved and very interested in this part of the world today. I'm not going to speak for very much longer, particularly if all the slides break. But I would just like to say a couple of things about northern Mali today, by way of establishing the scene in our minds. Obviously, we are all a very long way from northern Mali. And I do think it helps to have a map or two by way of focus. And this is one of those most beautiful satellite images of continental Africa with Arabia on the right and Europe to the north. This is the subject for today's panel. Northern Mali today. Terrorists, secessionists, and criminals. All too often, these categories are ignored or overlooked by so-called experts and commentators. It is vital that everybody in this room understands the difference before they leave today. By dint of sitting in this room this afternoon, you obviously have an interest. To that interest, I would like to add a new layer of information. I don't want you to think for a minute that these three categories are separate, as separate as the words appear on the screen in front of you, but there are overlaps, like an enormous Venn diagram that covers northern Africa. Again, by way of fixing the picture in our minds, here is a political outline of Africa from, let's say, 2 years ago, because I noticed that Sudan has yet to become 2 countries. Mali, obviously the southern neighbor, most importantly, of Algeria. And here it is again, back on that satellite map. Can you see this dot here? That's Timbuktu on the map. And down here is the capital, Bamako. It's a good 3-day bus journey between the two places. Worth bearing in mind when you wonder why people don't take more action, more quickly and more decisively. It is not an easy country in which to operate. This is my final comment before we turn the panel over to the 3 speakers. The groups operating in northern Mali are obviously very different. And if that sounds like an oversimplification, it's one that many commentators ignore. But they are also very fluid, with people moving between the different groups at different times for different reasons. These constituencies should all be understood, though, as they are in and of themselves, because they each have different aims. And this too is vital to anybody who is about to pursue policy in the country. And because of their different goals or different aims, they have different operational approaches. Again, something which I'm sure will become clear as we delve further. And one final slide I'm going to put up. There are a couple of suggestions, if you like, from me. The situation in Mali is complex, it is complicated, but without clear understanding, we run a very great risk of running in the wrong direction. With the clearest possible understanding, we can avoid this problem, particularly if we acknowledge that it requires tailor-made solutions. That's what Mali looks like if superimposed on a map of the 48 contiguous American states, to scale. Bear that in mind when you consider the size of the problem facing the international community and locals in Mali today. And without further ado, I will pass the clicker, the holy clicker, to Dr. Michael Shurkin, and I think an applause to welcome everybody to the panel.
Thank you. I hope you can read this on the screen. It's something that I found in the 13 January issue of the New York Times in an article by 3 authors, I believe, including Eric Schmidt. These are all very good journalists, by the way, top shelf stuff. But the stuff I put in yellow really just jumped out at me, and I was sort of aghast by it. But I was also wondering, you know, what does this mean in the eyes of all the people who are reading this newspaper? Because, you know, maybe it's sort of a Rorschach test. There are different people who sort of have a similar reaction to mine. Like, I read this and I think, oh my God, like the idiots. But the people I think are the idiots are probably different from the people that other people think are the idiots. But anyways, here we have this notion. Okay, the American trained units. There were, yes, American trained counterterrorism units in the Malian army that had been seen as the best hope of repelling such an advance. So I can read this here. This works. Repelling such an advance proved in the end to be a linchpin of the country's military defeat. The leaders of those elite units were Tuaregs, the very ethnic nomads who were overrunning northern Mali. And then I think 2 paragraphs down in the same article, this is a quote: "The aid of the Americans turned out not to be useful," said a ranking Mali officer now engaged in combat. "They made the wrong choice," he said, "of relying on commanders from a group that had been conducting a 50-year rebellion against the Malian state." And I look at this and I find this fascinating. First of all, there's this sort of the idea of passing judgment on an entire ethnic group, which I think is something that we should all be sort of skeptical about. But there's this idea of making choices. When you get involved, when one gets involved in any place that's not your own, and you have to choose, like, who are you going to work with, who are your partners, who are you going to train, where are you going to build your wells, what village is going to benefit from your humanitarian program. Everybody has to make choices, but the question is, how do you make those choices, and how do you know what you're doing? Because otherwise you can get in trouble. Now, the suggestion here is that the United States military got in trouble by picking Tuaregs. And if I could convince you of anything today, is like, that's just ridiculous. The mistake is certainly not trusting Tuaregs. It might have been trusting particular Tuaregs, because one has to know something about these people, which Tuaregs, which groups, who, what individuals. I mean, everybody's an individual, but it's just not so simple as this. Now, I have no particular insight into how the U.S. military does its thing, although one should never underestimate perhaps its ability to not know what it's doing when involved in places that are kind of alien to it. And so, I don't know how they vetted anybody that they were involved with or not. But at any rate, but this is what I want to pursue, because I think this is really very important. This question of sort of, who are the Tuaregs, who are the people in northern Mali, and then how on earth do you figure out who to work with? Now, some basic reasons why we need to think about this, and sometimes people ask me all the time. This is the problem I have when I do work, let's say at RAND, or when I'm trying to work with the military, or just very busy people who basically try to argue with me and say, well, why do I need to know this? Like, why is this important? What are we doing? And part of the argument and the reason why I think it's very important to have a good understanding of whom we're talking about is the fact that France's gains have not, how should I put this? This is not mission accomplished. If we look at what's going on, I mean, I think a lot of people felt a sense of relief. Oh, France is taking care of the problem for us. And I think it's important to stress that their gains have been very limited, and they're not likely to endure after French troops leave. So this is just important to keep in mind. The situation, I think, is very likely to revert back to the status quo ante once French troops leave, unless France and its allies lay the groundwork for some sort of political or security dispensation that's going to make its gains sustainable. Now, how to do that is sort of what we're going to talk about at length, but unless they do that, I think we're all going to be in trouble again. Part of this is this fact that the drivers of all the militancy, all of the reasons why we got into this semester that Mali is in crisis, all of those remain, and I'm going to discuss them in greater detail in a second. And also the fact that only local actors are going to be able to secure the peace. And I think this is important, given that neither the United States nor France nor anybody else really has any interest in getting deeply involved in Mali. I mean, France got involved, but they want to get out as fast as they can. And everybody wants to do the absolute minimum in Mali. So the less effort you want to invest in anything, the more you have to rely then on local actors. So, in other words, if we're looking past the intervention towards a stable Mali, we have to think about who the local people are. So, from my point of view, this kind of knowledge, who are these people, becomes inescapable. You have to know this stuff. You being the government's international community, the NGOs, anybody who's going to be involved in Mali from this day forward needs to know whom it's dealing with. Now, let's talk a little bit more detail about the drivers of conflict, because from my point of view, all of these things are intact, and unless they're addressed, we're going to have the problems of northern Mali are just going to keep coming back over and over again. I'm going to go sort of as a very surface level over all of these. The first thing that I want to stress, sometimes it seems self-evident, but since Mali is such an unknown entity for a lot of people, it's worth stressing over and over and over again. Economic distress is a gigantic factor. This is the Sahara Desert, basically. These people are extremely poor. More to the point, it is extremely difficult to survive in northern Mali. One of the best Mali scholars is a German anthropologist named Georg Klute, who entitled his dissertation on Mali, "The Hardest Job in the World." This is based on his experiences living with Tuareg nomads. It is very difficult to survive. They have the thinnest of safety margins. And anything that changes this situation is going to almost invariably have a negative impact. And basically what's happened over the last few decades is a variety of things have combined to basically put the northern Malian population into a permanent crisis. So they're always in crisis. The only thing, by and large, that has kept northern Malians alive is their ability to leave, to go somewhere else. So the fact that the surplus population has been able to go elsewhere, that's enabled them to survive, but it's extremely difficult to do. This is also important because in that kind of context, any source of revenue of any kind becomes an object of intense competition. This includes international aid organizations, NGOs. Who does the NGO hire? Who do they buy their stuff from? Whom are they going to rent their compound from? All these things become vitally important. It also means that drugs, the drug trade, which is really only about 10 years old in northern Mali, is incredibly corrosive just because in an environment where there is no cash, the kind of cash that the drugs trade brings in, it's a game changer. And also that economic opportunism is one of the single most important motivators for why anybody in northern Mali gets involved in militant groups. It's because these people offer, or at least did offer, a way to make a living. You know, if they're going to pay you a stipend or they're going to give your family some money, that's just great, because if you're a young Tuareg or Arab in northern Mali, you don't have many options for surviving. Lastly, or not lastly, we also have religious ferment. This is important. Mali has a reputation for being a bastion of a very moderate Sufi Islam, and it was popularized by a lot of Malian intellectuals. I'm thinking of the writer Ampa Deba. It's a very, sort of a kinder, gentler sort of form of Islam. And that's the reputation that Mali has. In the last few decades, there has been a lot of fervor in rather turmoil, I guess, in the Islamic world. Scholars have written about the Islamicization in the Malian public sphere. There's been this rise of what's referred to as reformist Islam, or Islams, because it comes in different varieties. These are sort of movements that are going to be very critical of sort of standard Sufi practices. Some of these forms of reformist Islam are full-blown Wahhabi. So you have a Wahhabi movement that's alive and well among certain communities in Mali. So there's a lot of ferment, there's a lot of turmoil. All of the sort of the givens about Malian society, it's this nice, gentle, moderate Islam, these things really aren't true anymore. And this is also part of the problem. So the militancy, to a large extent, is indigenous. This is not something that comes from the outside. And lastly, we have the inter and intra-communal competition. And this is what I'm going to dwell at more length, because I think this is very important to keep in mind. I think both of the speakers are going to be talking about this and sort of adding on to what I'm going to share with you. And I think this is very important for understanding how to build some sort of solution for moving forward. So very briefly, northern Mali. Northern Mali is very divided by race, caste, and clan. By race, basically, you can speak in terms of, I keep wanting to do air quotes. You have black Malians in the north, and you have white Malians in the north. By white, I'm basically referring to Arabs and Tuaregs, who define themselves as white. And race it's a strange construct. It's not really about skin color as much as it's about sort of creation myths about genealogy and social organizations and where one comes from. And with Arabs and Tuaregs, for instance, they have these sort of creation myths about their ultimate, that they're all sort of descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, or people who are close to the Prophet Muhammad. And this gives them sort of a credential. This gives them sort of it helps foster sort of a supremacist ideology. And one definition I've read of blacks in northern Mali is that blacks in northern Mali are basically those who cannot claim any kind of Arab descendants in the same way that the Arabs and the Tuaregs can. The basics, just sort of very briefly, Tuaregs are ethnic Berbers who speak sort of a Berber language. It's very loose definitions. Arabs, it's debatable whether or not the Arabs in northern Mali are actually Berber or they're actually ethnic Arabs, but either way they speak an Arab dialect, and that's sort of what distinguishes them from Tuaregs. And then the major black communities of northern Mali are the Pul and Songhai. Pul are also known as Fulani in other countries, and they have several other names for them. But within each of these communities, there are massive divisions in terms of caste and clans. By castes, you often have noble castes, vassal castes, slave castes, former slave castes. Within each of these categories, you have multiple clans among the Tuareg, or among the Arabs, you have tribes. So you've got this sort of crazy hierarchization within all of these communities. So the point being is that they're extremely divided among themselves, and this is something that I often harp on. It is almost never the case that one can really speak of the Tuaregs or the Arabs in terms of the Tuaregs have rebelled or the Arabs have rebelled. It's always only a few clans or a few tribes for a few specific reasons who have rebelled. And once you view it from that perspective, then everything really changes. And also, this is what I bear in mind when I read the New York Times article about the Tuaregs. You can't trust the Tuaregs, which is nonsense. And I'll discuss it a little bit more later too. The most powerful Tuareg confederation that's going to be referred to, I think, by the other speakers is what's known as the Kaladag, Adagh. The most powerful clans within them are often referred to as Afogas. And then the most powerful clan among them is something called the Kelafela. And the Kelafela clan is the clan of the Amenokal. The Amenokal is the traditional, sort of the king of the Tuareg, if you will, and sort of an elected position, more or less. And if you look at the different conflicts, just to sort of repeat, if you look at every rebellion since 1916, one finds the same story. It's always specific clans, specific tribes acting out for very specific reasons, and they often have very limited political objectives. Now, sort of to back that up, what I have here is a sort of a chart which is familiar to all the Mali experts. We all read the same Pierre Boilet work. It's sort of lifted from him. But in the 1990s, there was a general revolt, basically all the whites against Bamako. And this was the few instances in which you actually could say all the Tuaregs and all the Arabs actually acted together, but that really didn't last very long because very briefly it all fell apart, and what you had is a general melee in which all the different clans started fighting one another, and all of the castes and all the races, such that you have this multiplicity, this proliferation of militant groups, each one representing specific clans and specific tribes that's fighting one another for very specific reasons. And thus, very quickly, the rebellion of 1990 stopped really being about revolt against Bamako and became about jockeying for position among themselves. And that's the story. It's ultimately about this competition that they have going on. And there have been many more examples of this. For instance, in 2006, 2009, there was what some people call a pocket rebellion in northern Mali. And again, it's one or two Tuareg clans with a very specific agenda of trying to elevate their position vis-a-vis the other Tuareg clans. And ultimately, the Malian government crushed it, but they crushed it by picking Tuareg clans who are their enemies and basically mobilizing them against them. The leader of the Tuareg clans, who are the enemies, was a man by the name of Aji Agamu, who's now the most powerful Tuareg commander in the Malian military. That's why I mention him, because he's one of the most important players today. And he was the military commander of a militant group in the 1990s called ARLA. His group, ARLA, was sort of the arch enemy of the group MPA, which was a militia that basically fought to defend the privileges of the elite Tuareg, the Afoga. So there's this whole backstory to the conflict between them, and that's playing out today in terms of the relationship between Iyad Agrali, the head of the Afoga militia, who also then became the head of the Ansar Dina's extremist group, and then this Agamu, who's the former arch enemy and who is now sort of the leader of the sort of the pro-government forces. Today, this plays out, or rather 2012. I really do not know what's going on this year since the French intervention of these groups. But if you look very closely at the Malian militant groups, you find similar patterns where one can find, this is all sort of uncorroborated reporting, press releases, journal articles, newspaper articles, interviews with people who've got a lot of on-the-ground expertise, where there's always, again, there's this correlation between militant groups and specific tribes and specific clans. And while I can't corroborate any of this, all of it makes sense. I can tell you a narrative to explain specifically why it is that the Idnan clan is involved with this militant group, whereas the other clan is with the other militant group. So it all makes sense. It all sort of fits everything we know about their history, their history of militancy. Now, to get to this question of successful local engagement, and this is maybe all just rebuttal to that New York Times article. One thing that I find fascinating when reading about northern Mali, and I sort of also think about maybe I don't know, other places where the U.S. government has been involved, places like Afghanistan, is the extent to which the French, at least the colonial French, I don't know about the French today, really knew what they were doing. It's like, I don't know where they got this knowledge, but they figured it out. And one of the things that they understood when they invaded northern Mali, which was in 1894, they knew that they were completely outmanned, not outgunned, but outmanned and powerless vis-a-vis all the Tuaregs who controlled northern Mali. They knew they were weak. They were, as far as I know, there were never more than 100 French in all of northern Mali during the entire period of conquest and consolidation of their control. If you think back to that map that we showed with Mali superimposing the United States, that's incredible. 100 French officers and non-commissioned officers, actually less than, I think about 70, in charge of a few hundred African infantry, and they're the ones who pulled it off. And I think because they understood their own weakness, they knew that they had to be smart, and that they knew that they had to collect a lot of really good information, intelligence, and then play games in terms of choosing people, choosing local partners, and they did it brilliantly. They did it so well that they had 44 years of peace after they crushed the last revolt against them in 1916. And what they did is they destroyed the most powerful Tuareg confederation by picking two powerful but subordinate groups, one Tuareg group and an Arab group, and then they made allies of them. And that's how they did it. And then they sort of deputized the one Tuareg group and made them sort of the bosses of northern Mali. And they're the ones who guaranteed security for the French. They being the man the father of the current Amenakal, the Afoga tribe, the Fogo clans. And this whole hierarchy that we speak of today, the French created that in effect over 100 years ago. Now, during the 1990 Tuareg rebellion, the Malian government dealt with it by reactivating the arrangements that the colonial French did, which is basically they went back to the Afogas. Now, this time they went back to Iyad Agrali, who's now the champion of them, and they made the same kind of deal with them. Now, there's an interesting difference, though. When the French did it, they understood that the Afogas' interests were congruent with their own. France knew what it wanted. They knew what the Afogas wanted. The Afogas knew what the French wanted, and it worked brilliantly. This time around, in effect, Bamako was lazy. They sort of went for a very short-term fix, so thus they turned to Iyad Agrali and this one particular Tuareg clan, a group of clans, whose interests really did not coincide with the Malian government's interests. And I think this is a serious problem. This is also why we have unrest, whereas France managed to create peace. This sort of lack of understanding of the interests of this particular groups with whom one decides to align. And then it did not help that in 2009, in order to smash the 2006-2009 revolt, the Malian government switched sides. And as I mentioned before, instead of backing the same set of clans that the French started backing in the 1900s, early 1900s, they switched sides and they went after different groups, and they mobilized different groups to then go and beat up on the elites. It's not clear exactly what the impact of that was, but it cannot have helped Bamako's relations with these elites, and I think it explains why those same elites rallied to Ansar Dine in 2012. Now, looking forward to the future, and hopefully concluding so I can pass the holy clicker, I think that international actors who are serious about trying to help out, and this is true for NGOs, it's true for special forces, it's true for whomever is involved, one needs to think very carefully about whom you're dealing with, and one needs to try to pick partners who have interests who are congruent with one's own. But this entire gambit, the whole venture, is something that one absolutely has to do. It reminds me of what Pascal wrote in his Pensée, where he's talking about like why it is that you should have faith in God, and he says, if you're even asking this question, it's too late. Vous êtes déjà embarqué, like you're there, you're doing this. And that's sort of my message. I get this resistance sometimes, and people in the U.S. government say, well, why should I care about getting involved with local actors? And I think, you've been doing it now for 10 years, if not longer. You will be doing it, and anytime any U.S. government people show up, even if they think they're just building wells, what they are in fact doing is picking partners and affecting the political situation. So the question is how to do that, or it becomes then imperative to do that smart. And I kind of use the French colonial forces as my model, not to say that they did everything and that we should emulate them. The only thing we should emulate them is, in a sense, the fact that they were smart And so I would urge everybody to just get smart first and then do smart things before one creates more problems. And I think I'll actually close with that and then pass the clicker. Thank you.
I'm gonna stand up here so I can see my own slides. Is that the papers to pass us to say 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute?
While Larry makes his way to the podium, I'm just going to ask for somebody to distribute paper, please. On which you may have, and we'll take them up for the Q&A session later.
Is this yours, or is this? Well, those are much better than mine. Yeah, okay. Well, thanks very much. My name's Larry Velty, and